Hello and welcome to this Classical Next conversation. And it's a huge sadness not to be doing it face to face, but we're offering you the next best thing, a conversation by Zoom. Now, anyone who has an interest in recorded classical music, I suspect will have an album on their shelves with a yellow spine, be it an LP, a cassette, or a CD. Behind me, I'm sure you can pick out a few CDs with yellow spines. They, of course, belong to the yellow label itself, Deutsche Grammophon. And it gives me enormous pleasure to be spending the next half an hour, three-quarters of an hour, however long it takes, talking to the president of Deutsche Grammophon, Dr. Clemens Trautmann. Well, lovely to hook up with you again, albeit digitally, Clemens.
Well, thank you for having me, James, and the pleasure is entirely mine.
Now, I thought we might start off our conversation by trying to go back and recall our very first encounter with DG as a label. Perhaps you'll indulge me if I go first, but I think I need probably go back to the middle 70s when I was about 15 years old. And at the time, my parents were living in Indonesia. And I decided, in retrospect, I have no idea why, not to go to Indonesia one holiday, but to spend it with my aunt in Bristol. And my aunt, she had quite an interest in classical music. She was quite enthusiastic. She was the first person who took me to my first opera. And she'd recently fallen in love with the Brahms violin concerto. So one day we decided that we would go into Bristol, the town centre, and buy ourselves a recording to listen to. And we went to this wonderful shop called Radio Rentals. This was back in the time when you actually used to rent your TV set. But at the back of the store, it had a really very good classical record department. And I remember us going in and leafing through the LP bins. And there were a lot, even back then, there were a lot of recordings of the Brahms violin concerto and, on all sorts of labels. And something, and I can't quite recall why, but something drew us to the recording with a big yellow cartouche on the top. And it was Christian Ferras, the Berlin Philharmonic, and Herbert von Karajan. And there was something about the packaging that just kind of said, buy me, this is a classy product. And of course, that's the one. We paid our money, we left the shop, and we enjoyed enormously. So that was my first encounter with DG. And all these years later, I still can't quite imagine that, I passed through being editor and now editor-in-chief of a magazine who has reviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of DG recordings down the years. Perhaps, Clemens, you tell us how you first encountered the label.
Well, my first DG recording actually was like the expected one for a child, the Magic Flute. It was actually the recording by Karl Böhm with the Berlin Philharmonic and with the magical Fritz Wunderlich and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. So actually some notable figures of the DG family had gathered there in 1964 for that recording. And I enjoyed that tremendously as a child. And after probably a few months' time, I could recount all of the lines of the Magic Flute, which I cannot do anymore these days, but it might come back. And what will also come back is that very, very special, rich sound, the orchestra sound, and that wonderful timbre of Fritz Wunderlich. This is something that you'll never forget when you've listened as a child.
And did you always have a sort of passion for collecting recordings? Because I often think that there is a difference between the person who's a music lover and the bulk of their music sort of consumption takes place in concert halls. And then there's this sort of slightly different species that actually is passionate about recordings. And I think I probably, if you look behind me, probably fall as much into the second category as in the first. I mean, were recordings back in your sort of teens and 20s a passion for you?
Well, that was actually, my primary passion during those teenage days. And the record dealer in my hometown, Braunschweig, she was almost family or a close friend. So I turned up in the record store probably twice or three times a week, checked out the latest arrivals and the catalog. And this is, I guess, how I became acquainted with this music world. there was a gap of probably 20, 25 years, but didn't seem such a long time once I got started here at DG.
And tell us a little bit about your sort of musical background. I mean, you're a clarinetist. How did you go from being, a sort of clarinet student, and then perhaps you could fill in as to what happened between you playing the clarinet at a very decent level and studying it to becoming president of Deutsche Grammophon?
Well, I'll try to cut that story as short as I possibly can. So actually, when I started studying the clarinet with Sabine Meyer and Rainer Wehle in Lübeck at the conservatory, as well as with Charles Neidig at the Juilliard School, I was actually on track to become a professional clarinetist and an orchestra musician. Probably I did a lot of solo and chamber stuff as well. But I felt that probably it wasn't my calling for the next 30 or 40 years. So I got immersed into arts management. I was so lucky to work for 2 consecutive summers for mostly Mozart Festival at Lincoln Center. And having returned to Germany, I took up law. Actually, I went to law school, and I really wanted to reconcile these 2 worlds, the arts and law and economics, if you like. And actually, I had 2 options when I finished my studies, both my clarinet studies and my legal studies. One was the more serious one, become a law professor, and the other was less serious, probably joining a media company that was in the middle of a digital transformation, Axel Springer, a traditional newspaper company headquartered in Berlin, and I started there as the chief of staff to the CEO, Matthias Döpfner, who actually happened to be a musicologist by training. Within a time span of 5 years, Axel Springer actually became an almost purely digital player and a relevant factor in the European and international media scene, also by acquiring Business Insider and being part of that ride and that function. I think that was very formative. Also, the last 3 years of my work for Axel Springer, I served as CFO of a digital enterprise, an affiliate, a subsidiary, which was a property portal, interestingly. And at that property portal, I learned all about CRM, online marketing, Google Analytics, and so forth. So that was really an important experience that I still draw upon here in my role, where I need to bridge the arts and commercial considerations.
I mean, was one of your first tasks at DG when you arrived as president, I mean, was it basically trying to pull the company into a sort of mindset that you were used to at your previous job, that, digital was an incredibly important part of our new world, and drawing on things, you learnt in your last job so that you could apply them to, a very different kind of company. But actually, in many respects, there are certain similarities, about meeting, getting to an audience, marketing material, and so on and so forth.
Well, actually, DG has always had an entrepreneurial spirit, fortunately. So in the early 2000s, this label was the first to introduce its own web shop. We have been the first label to be present on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram, and have grown a considerable reach there. And so it was already kind of a startup atmosphere when I started here in 2016, and I try to reinforce that.
Let's just talk briefly about the yellow cartouche, which is something that's always fascinated me, both sort of as attached to LPs and CDs, but also just as a kind of symbol. And I remember many years ago interviewing the legendary art director of Deutsche Grammophon, Pali Melamarkovic, who was really instrumental in the look of the label and establishing it. One of the things I noticed when you joined Deutsche Grammophon was that the yellow cartouche suddenly sort of retook its place where it always traditionally used to be, on the front of album sleeves. And whether even as a sort of postage stamp on Apple Music or Spotify, it's still very much there, and it's still a very powerful symbol. I mean, was that one of your first sort of missions to, as it were, re-establish?
Well, that yellow cartouche probably was as dear to me as it was to you. And this is, what everybody associates with Deutsche Grammophon. The first thing that comes to mind. And on a more strategic level, not just on the, emotional and nostalgic level, it also serves a very important purpose of distinguishing repertoire, hopefully by quality. And if Deutsche Grammophon in a traditional record store was a quality seal that would tell apart like 3 or 5 recordings of the same piece, on streaming services, one has now probably 1,000 or several thousand of major repertoire pieces. And I think it becomes even more important to have a noticeable quality seal. This is what we have tried.
Because it is quite striking that if you look through a playlist on any of the streaming sites, I mean, the ones that really do sort of catch your eye, just because there's a sort of consistency, are DG sleeves. I mean, is that something you would recommend to another label to kind of establish some kind of brand identity that actually works on that very, very small scale?
Well, I mean, there are many ways to accomplish that, and ECM, for instance, has developed a very, very clear identity that's recognizable, even though the cover motives and also the arrangements of photos and font, all of that varies, but it's still a very, very clear identity that Manfred Eicher and his team has developed there. And there are other great examples. Right behind you, I see a lot of EMI, but that brand obviously has vanished.
I mean, one of the interesting things for anybody working in the record industry, this kind of extraordinary balancing act you have to make between art and commerce, creativity, and the commercial. I mean, is that something you're conscious of every day you go into the office?
Yes, we are very conscious of that. But the funny thing is, this is often positioned as a conflict. And we at DG, and I personally, we just don't perceive it that way, because most often the artistically daring records and the experimental records are also the commercially groundbreaking ones, and they open up completely new areas. For instance, when we started our collaboration with Mirga Gražinytė-Tyla, the music director of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, roughly a year ago, actually she didn't choose, and we didn't choose, standard repertoire, any kind of cycle of one of the great Bs, but she went for Mieczysław Weinberg, 2 symphonies, and I thought that was quite bold as a statement, but also as a commercial proposition, and actually it was a huge chart success on top of the critical acclaim.
And you've recently brought out a recording of music by Thomas Adès, which includes the piano concerto. I mean, in many respects, that's a slightly riskier venture than the sort of whatever we might call neoclassical music. I mean, what is the philosophy behind doing something like that? Because it doesn't immediately have kind of commercial success written over it, or is it a much more finely tuned sort of business model for a recording like that?
Well, isn't there anything more exciting than a completely new piece of music, a completely new composition? And that is the case with the Thomas Adès piano concerto in a performance by Kirill Gerstein and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who premiered that piece. And also the John Adams concerto that was premiered by Yuja Wang, Gustavo Dudamel, and the LA Phil that also came out recently. I think it's incredibly exciting to discover a completely new piece of music. And so I think, especially in a streaming age, when all services are saturated with the same material over and over again. Well, different interpretations for sure, but the same repertoire. I think it's wonderful to have these fresh additions.
I mean, there are many examples, I guess, looking back through the DG catalogue of things like that. I mean, DG was one of the first companies to record Steve Reich, one of the first major companies to record Steve Reich's music.
I'm glad you're mentioning Steve Reich drumming. That was the debut release. And also Philip Glass, the violin concerto and the performance by Gidon Kremer with the Vienna Philharmonic came roughly at the same time. And actually those recordings, they opened up a completely new chapter, a chapter that we're now resuming with releases by Max Richter, Johan Johansson, Agnes Obel, and Joop Beving. So I think it is, this minimalist theme. This is a continuation of what we used to do. It's not something completely novel that we've started.
Another example of that, quite a famous example of that, is when Herbert von Karajan decided that he wanted to record, all the music that he could record of the composers of the Second Viennese School, and famously the people at DG were a bit nervous about this until he said, well, he would waive his fee for this recording, and it went on to be incredibly successful. And I guess that's also given us a nice introduction to talk a little bit about Karajan, because I mean, for certainly people of my generation, I mean, Karajan for many years was kind of DG was Karajan, Karajan was DG. I mean, that was an extraordinary example of an artist sort of fusing with a label.
Well, I actually had a conversation with the Karajan Institute lately, and we did some research for that. And the total amount of music that Karajan had recorded for Deutsche Grammophon is actually 405 hours of music. I forgot about the minutes and seconds, but I think it's an incredible body of work, not only in terms of quantity, but obviously also in quality. It encompassed the almost entire symphonic repertoire. And what is also interesting, I think, is that his legacy, in a way, is shaping the label until today, not just in terms of catalog editions, but also in terms of the artists that we collaborate with, because we still work with Anne-Sophie Mutter. We've been working with Anne-Sophie for 42 years now, and we still work with Yevgeny Kissin, and those are two artists whose careers Karajan helped launch.
Because one of the things that Karajan did, which not many other artists did, I mean, they sort of followed him, was basically returning to his core repertoire on a regular basis. He recorded the Beethoven symphonies for DG 3 times. He'd already recorded them once before for EMI with the Philharmonia. And then, of course, he went on to re-record certain works of the repertoire. I mean, he returned to the Tchaikovsky symphonies, he returned to the Dvorak symphonies. I mean, do you think that's something, actually, that's a thing of the past? Conductors returning, or artists returning to repertoire? Or will there always be little sort of pockets of, you can say, actually, yes. I mean, most recently, I guess, someone like Maurizio Pollini has returned to the last few Beethoven piano sonatas. I mean, is that an exception rather than the rule?
Well, revisiting repertoire is certainly a very, very interesting endeavor, but mostly for the artist himself, and obviously for us connoisseurs. I could spend days just comparing different versions, different recordings, and probably that's the same with you, James.
Well, we would only have to grab a few sets of the Beethoven symphonies from behind me, and we'd probably be going for quite a few weeks.
Absolutely. So, and in the case of Maurizio Pollini, revisiting the late Beethoven sonatas, it was actually a very interesting case, and then had a few conversations with Maurizio on that topic. And I think there needs to be an absolutely compelling reason to go back to repertoire that has already been recorded by yourself or by notable colleagues. And in that case, it was actually the fact that he had never recorded these pieces audiovisually. So together with Arte, we did an audiovisual production at Herkules Saal in Munich. And also, what was very interesting compared to the 1970s version, that's obviously an iconic recording, was that Maurizio performed these pieces live, and you could really feel the fight and the struggle to get it right with this amazing music. And that was very, very moving, and I think it not only translates on the video recording, but also on the audio album.
We've talked about Steve Reich's drumming, and we've talked about the Carryon Second Viennese School box. I mean, these are recordings, from kind of, not ancient history, but, they're getting on a bit now. And obviously they would have had many years to recoup their costs and move into profit. I mean, do you sort of calculate your new projects on a kind of cycle, saying, we envisage that this recording will make money in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or perhaps never even recoup its costs because for some other reason you want to add it to your catalogue?
DG often is perceived as a cultural institution, and this is also how we see ourselves, but at the same time one needs to acknowledge we don't get any subsidies, no donations for our records. So everything that we do needs to prove itself actually on the market. And the time frames, they may differ from project to project, but in general, I think it is very correct to say that DG is all about longevity. Just look at the duration of our artist relationships. So we've been working with Maurizio Pollini for almost 60 years now, with Anne-Sophie Mutter for over 40 years, and Carryon was with the label for half a century, with a small break. And so this is actually quite remarkable about how, all of my predecessors have approached things, and I try to, stay true to that philosophy, and that entails taking risks with an artistic project that we truly believe in.
And do you think the role of a recording for an artist has changed? Because, one could go back 20, 30 years and say that actually a recording formed, actually quite a major source of income for an artist. Whereas nowadays, it's questionable how much money an artist would make, or maybe they even see it in a different way, that they have a sort of, a very glamorous calling card to say, well, look, I have an album here on the yellow label, and that almost certainly must guarantee they get bookings with orchestras and ensembles and concert halls around the world, because in a way you are a kind of a mark of a sort of brand of quality. I mean, do you think some artists see it actually that way?
Well, definitely it's our aspiration to be that quality seal that also extends beyond just the recorded music world. And I think when I talk to artistic directors and partners from the live business, there's a lot of trust in what we do. And at the same time, these conversations are incredibly helpful to identify talent also for us. So I think it goes in both directions. And coming from the live world myself, having done a lot of chamber performances, some solo performances with orchestra, actually the recorded music world was novel to me. And so I don't see that kind of opposition of these two worlds. I think that we live in a very coherent ecosystem that now is actually, due to the corona crisis, broken to a certain extent. But it used to be a very coherent ecosystem where everybody had an important role, the labels, the promoters, the agents, and I do hope we are able to return to those partnerships.
Here we are in Beethoven year, and if one company kind of sort of stands up and as it were represents Beethoven, I mean, in many ways it's Deutsche Grammophon. I mean, you've got a phenomenal tradition. Countless sets of the Beethoven symphonies. Quite a few versions of the piano sonatas. Quite a few recordings of Fidelio, and so on and so on. I mean, when you come to make a new recording, Andris Nelsons, for example, with the Vienna Philharmonic, I mean, in a way, some of the strongest competition for that recording actually comes from within your own company. The 3 sets from Carryon, the 2 sets from Abbado, and on and on. Is this something you're sort of conscious of? Because it's a very unusual industry to find, often quite heavy competition coming actually from within the very company that is producing, as it were, a new product. I can't think of anything quite like it outside the recording world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, that is a conversation that we have quite often internally, as well as with our artists. And again, there needs to be an absolutely compelling reason to turn to specific repertoire and to set your recording apart from all these wonderful renditions that have been done by notable colleagues, because all of these versions obviously are available at your fingertips on a streaming platform, or can be activated by voice control with just one command. And so there needs to be that compelling reason, and it can either be completely new interpretation, completely new soundscape, or obviously what is also very interesting, if there are alternate versions of a recording. For instance, this plan didn't materialize because to the current situation, but there was the plan to also record the Beethoven cycle with Yannick Nézet-Séguin and the Chamber Orchestra of Europe. And that would have been the premiere recording on the basis of the new Beethoven edition. And actually there are quite a few interesting changes as compared to the version that we all know. Some of them can be really heard, like I think counter bassoon coming in the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony. So I think this is there needs to be that discussion, and there needs to be that awareness that one needs an absolutely compelling reason to revisit repertoire.
I mean, 2 conductors we've just mentioned recently. You've just been talking about Yannick Nézet-Séguin. I mentioned Andris Nelsons. What do you feel that your role as their recording label is? I mean, is it more than just simply being an outlet for their performances? I mean, is it something closer? I mean, how would you describe your relationship with your artists, your key sort of exclusive artists, perhaps?
I perceive this relationship and the label actually as a whole is kind of a virtual home to our artists. And within that home, all sorts of wonderful things can happen. And especially these 2 artists are a good example when it comes to collaborations. So, for instance, the recent Rachmaninoff piano concerto cycle by Daniil Trifonov was done in a partnership with Yannick Nézet-Séguin. Also the Mozart cycle in Baden-Baden with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe and Yannick is a wonderful example for collaborations. In this case, Rolando Villazon and many other wonderful singers. In the case of Andris Nelsons, there have been beautiful collaborations, for instance, with Hélène Grimaud for the Brahms concertos. And there are actually quite a few also in the making for both Gewandhaus. For instance, there's a project coming up with Yevgeny Kissin, and the continuation of the Shostakovich cycle in Boston also with soloists. So I think it's wonderful to foster these collaborative projects, and I think that's what makes a label exciting and interesting also.
And what about having other artists performing with other artists on your label? So there's a sort of, a kind of family feeling. I mean, for example, there's a new a sort of shortish series you've just launched with Matthias Görner, where he was accompanied by Jan Lisiecki, which is a very interesting putting together of two artists, both at very different periods in their careers. I mean, is that something that excites you on this sort of A&R front?
Absolutely. I think this is what's worth working and living for, to create these new constellations and observe the spark and the freshness of it, as we can just observe with the Beethoven song album that Matthias Görner and Jan Liszewski produced. And there will be more albums coming with Daniel Trifonov. There's a collaboration with Song Jin Cho. And let me also mention a rather unusual example for such a collaboration, which is Hildur Gudnadottir. When we announced her signing to DG, that was close to the release of The Joker, and she sort of exploded on the worldwide music scene during award season. People's reactions were along the lines of, "Oh, sure thing, you guys signed the likely Oscar winner." And that just wasn't the case. People didn't realize that we had been working with Hildur in collaborations for quite a few years. For instance, she had recorded with Johan Johansson. She had done a beautiful rework of a Bach piece for Vikingur Olafsson. And so there had been a pre-existing relationship that then evolved and blossomed.
I mean, you just mentioned Vikingur just now. I mean, he's Gramophone's Artist of the Year. He's probably the most talked about pianist on the planet at the moment. I mean, maybe we could just sort of unpick the Vikingur Olafsson DG relationship, because I think, people from a sort of smaller label might be interested in this. And obviously, people coming in from, as it were, outside our world would be interesting. I mean, here we have an artist, he's in his 30s. He's made 3 recordings for you. He started off with Philip Glass. Then he did a disc of Bach, and then Bach in transcription. And then just very, very recently, a recording of Debussy Rameau, which has gone completely wild. And I don't think I've ever actually seen a piano record, or any other record, frankly, that has just sort of taken off like that. And if you look on social media, it's just gone crazy. I mean, could you perhaps talk us a little bit through the way, you approach the whole Vikingur Olafsson phenomenon, and how it sort of started and how you see it developing?
Well, I think it's a love affair with constant surprises, and also the beginning of that was unusual. We got to meet Vikingur in 2016 through our network in Berlin, and also that is probably important to note that he did not come through to us through a recommendation by, say, a major conductor, or that he won a major competition. He actually got in touch with us through our local network, and we were intrigued and arranged a private concert, if you like, at the Chamber Hall of the Berlin Phil. And Vikingur performed the entire set of Goldberg variations for us. And it was actually probably 30 from our team who attended that concert, even though it was 10 in the morning and traffic was terrible, and Vikingur came in only 5 minutes before he was supposed to play that major set of variations. But everybody was spellbound, and we just knew we needed to work together, and fortunately that materialized.
I mean, if you look at the repertoire he's recorded, I mean, it's unusual. It's sort of not the usual sort of what you would expect from a young pianist. I mean, each has been beautifully chosen. I mean, to launch him with an album of Philip Glass is sort of quite surprising, and then following it up with Bach, and then this wonderful fusion of Debussy and Rameau, which is a stroke of genius. I mean, there's no suggestion in all that he suddenly wants to race off and record all the Beethoven piano concertos or do an album of Mozart piano concertos. I mean, how do you see his career developing with you? Will it be these beautifully curated projects, do you think?
Well, what's interesting, I think most of these projects in Vikingur's mind have been preconceived. When we started working with him, he was probably 32, and by that time his musicianship, his artistry, his musical philosophy had more or less fully formed. because he didn't have that recording and performance career that would take him to different continents every other day and wouldn't give any room for reflection. And I think this is very, very fortunate that he can, draw upon these preconceived ideas and concepts, and it's like a treasure trove, and out comes every time a wonderful surprise. And I think it doesn't make a difference that his piano playing and his philosophy have evolved over 2 decades without being in the limelight.
Because the interesting thing about Vikingur is I mean, in so many ways, he's a breath of fresh air. He's a young classical performer who doesn't sort of do crossover albums. He's presented in a very contemporary, a very modern, a very stylish way. And the thing that he does, which is in some respects quite old-fashioned, is actually he offers albums. He offers, music making that is conceived on a large scale. I mean, yes, sure, you could cherry pick his albums, but actually they have way more impact if you sit down and you listen to them from end to end. I mean, is that something, you respond to him as an artist?
Well, that's very central to Vikingur's musical belief. And that belief is that recording is an entirely different art form from performing. So he just doesn't take a piece that he would perform on stage in that same way to the studio, switches on the mics, and out comes an album. An album for Vikingur is a piece of art in itself. It is a musical journey. And what's also quite interesting is that he experiments with the track order for, not only weeks, but sometimes months, until he gets that journey right. It's the right sequence of pieces, very interesting juxtapositions. In this respect, I think the recent Debussy Rameau album is very telling, because for the first time that musical journey doesn't involve just one composer like Bach or Philip Glass, but actually two who are 200 years apart. And still it seems like a split second when you have that juxtaposition of Rameau and Debussy. Sometimes you can't even tell one composer apart from the other.
Now we're having this conversation clearly not face to face, over Zoom. Here I am in England talking to you in Berlin, and the one thing that struck me over the last couple of months is how quickly and imaginatively musical life in Berlin adapted to new technologies and not new technologies, but it made use of existing technologies. I mean, for example, we've had Daniel Hope at home, and now he's going sort of Daniel Hope on tour. We've had your moment musical or musical moment, or whichever language it's supposed to be in. Your streamed concerts from Berlin. The Berlin Philharmonic quickly kind of adapted their digital concert hall. We've had artists in Berlin streaming from their homes. We've had streaming services based in Berlin adapting. I mean, the company that oversees classical next, Piranha Arts, is based in Berlin. I mean, I get the feeling that there's a sort of zeitgeist or some kind of spirit in the city that allows this sort of thing to happen, and happen really quite fast.
I think that's a correct observation, and probably it dates back already 10, 12 years when major startups and IT companies emerged in Berlin. And actually, I see a lot of these people, entrepreneurs, the developers, I see them at concerts, at our Yellow Lounge event series. And those scenes, the art scene and the tech scene, they really merge in Berlin. And so Berlin is kind of a hotbed for innovation, also when it comes to combining the arts and technology. And it's quite wonderful to work with partners like the Digital Concert Hall and Idagio in this space. And I'm really happy that my team also embraced the opportunity and really rose to the challenge. How can we present live performances and classical music at all to our audiences during these difficult days?
I mean, I get the impression that the reason that Berliners can kind of pull this off, where other countries have lagged a little bit or other cities have lagged a bit, is that there's a respect for classical music that runs right through generations and through societies. So you have young sort of tech people in their 20s and 30s, and even if classical music isn't their sort of music of choice, there's a respect. They understand it. They realise it's got a tradition, and actually it does. It is the cogs that turn sort of a lot of the artistic life in your city. I mean, do you think that's a fair observation? Because, I wouldn't say that's the same, for example, in London.
I think you're absolutely right, James. There's not a single concert here in Berlin that I attend where I wouldn't bump into an old friend or colleague from the media or tech world. So there is this respect for classical music and the sense that there's a huge inherent value in this music.
And we've been put through some sort of very strange times in the last couple of months, under lockdown, not being able to go out and hear live music. I mean, in my view, live music actually means music when there's an audience in the hall. I know it's a sort of term that seems to have metamorphosized a little bit recently, and actually nowadays a lot of people are just saying sticking a pianist in a hall and pointing a camera is a live situation, and I'm not quite sure I would necessarily agree with that. So we've lost, live music according to my definition of the world. I mean, do you think you've learnt things from the last 2 months that will be important to you going forward over the next 6 months, year, or whatever?
Well, first of all, one needs to be very adaptive and creative, and that we were able to pull off the Musical Moments series from Meistersaal Berlin with a series of DJ artists, and from Pierre Boulez Hall with Daniel Barenboim. I thought it was quite remarkable and actually did take a lot of energy, but the motivation was huge at DG because we felt we had a mission to accomplish, even though maybe those performances weren't live music in the sense that you just described. They really mattered to people, and we got lots of responses, and we found, yes, these performances, they provide comfort, they provide hope, but at the same time we've now realized that we need to explore, just several weeks later, other models, additional models to serve our artists, because, well, this is the position that we are put in and this is our task. And there's a huge demand now for classical performance, fortunately, still during these challenging days. And we are trying to meet that demand with innovative solutions. And we are about to launch a new platform, DG Premium, that will start tomorrow, Wednesday. And as a first basic package, we are going to offer a series of live performances, recorded live performances by the Berlin Philharmonic, from our Yellow Lounge Club series, and very special events such as the Deutsche Grammophon anniversary concert in Beijing's Forbidden City. But the true purpose of that platform will hopefully come to fruition a few weeks later in June, when we also launch a ticketed service, so that destination will be able to meet the demand both on the artist side as well as on the part of the audience to experience live performances. And I think the notion that these performances need to be paid for, I think that is very important to maintain that notion, because we've seen a race to the bottom in the last few months for very good reasons, for very honorable reasons, but it is paramount that we keep the notion alive that classical music, that music in general, has not only an artistic but also monetary value.
So would it be fair to say that we're seeing a sort of subtle shift of boundaries perhaps as to what a record company traditionally can do, and that you're moving a little bit more into the sort of the live music arena, a little bit of sort of impresario-ism going on? I mean, do you see the boundaries of what what your remit is to have moved a little bit, or perhaps even been forced to move a little bit?
As a matter of fact, we don't see ourselves as artistic directors of a virtual concert hall. This is not our role. Our role is to serve our artists wherever there's need. And this is definitely a situation that calls for new solutions. And as before, we are a media partner. So we actually do the same job that Deutsche Grammophon was established for, which is connecting audiences and artists through media. Just remember Emil Berliner, the founder of DG and the inventor of the gramophone, was actually the first to combine technology and creative content and make music accessible outside of concert halls and chamber music sessions at home. So this is still our mission, and I'm actually proud that Emil Berliner's entrepreneurial spirit is still to a certain extent present here at DG.
And I'm sure one of Deutsche Grammophon's greatest artists, and certainly one of its biggest stars, Herbert von Karajan, I'm sure would be looking down, nodding with appreciation at what you're doing, especially as a lot of it will be taking place in Berlin, which was kind of, where his centre of operation was. So, Clemens, I just want to say thank you so much for sparing the time and coming and sharing your wisdom. I'd wanted to do a talk like this with you for a couple of years, and last year, for whatever reason, we couldn't do it face to face, nor could we do it face to face this year. But we've got the next best thing. So, thanks again for your time. Thanks for your wisdom, and best of luck in your new ventures at the Yellow Label.
Well, thank you so much, James. What I'd actually like to do is to explore your record collection just behind you, ideally with a glass of red wine, and hopefully we'll be able to do so soon.
Yes, we have. I have some quite antique CDs going right back to the very.
Oh, I'm sure you have. Wonderful. No, thanks for your time and the insights.
And hopefully see you soon.